Cold brew coffee has become one of the most talked about drinks in the coffee world over the last decade. You'll find it at specialty cafes, major chains, and even convenience stores. But despite how popular it's become, a lot of people still aren't sure exactly what it is, how it's made, or how it's different from other cold coffee drinks. This video covers everything you need to know about cold brew, from what it actually is, to how to make it at home, to whether it really is lower in acid and caffeine than people say. Let's start with the basics. Cold brew is a coffee beverage made by combining large amounts of ground coffee with cold or room temperature water and letting it steep for an extended period of time, typically somewhere between 12 and 24 hours. After steeping, the coffee is filtered and refrigerated. Because of the very high ratio of coffee to water used in the process, the result is a concentrate that's almost always diluted with water or milk before drinking. The key thing that separates cold brew from every other type of coffee is that no heat is involved. Unlike espresso, drip coffee, or even iced coffee, cold brew never touches hot water at any point during brewing. That one difference changes just about everything: the flavor, the texture, the caffeine content, the shelf life, and even how it affects your stomach. There are two main methods used to make cold brew. The first and most common is the immersion method, where ground coffee is fully submerged in cold water and left to steep. This is the method most people use at home and the one most cafes rely on for large batches. The second method is called slow drip, or Kyoto style, where cold water is slowly dripped over a bed of ground coffee over the course of several hours, passing through the grounds and into a vessel below. Slow drip produces a slightly brighter, cleaner cup, and it's faster than immersion, taking around 3 to 6 hours rather than 12 to 24. You might have seen one of those tall, elegant slow drip towers at a specialty cafe. They look complicated, but the principle is straightforward. Cold brew actually has a much longer history than most people realize. The earliest records of it come from 17th century Japan, where it became known as Kyoto-style coffee. One tradition holds that cold brew was introduced to Japan by Dutch sailors who carried it on long voyages as a convenient caffeinated drink. Kyoto developed its own version of the slow drip method, which is still used today. By the 1800s, cold brew had spread through Asia, Europe, and North America, often used as a kind of concentrate that families would mix with boiling water to make a quick cup of coffee. The modern cold brew movement really kicked off in 2011 when Stumptown coffee roasters in Portland started bottling and selling cold brew, and the demand was immediate. Starbucks picked it up in 2015, and the category has kept growing ever since. So what does cold brew actually taste like? The flavor profile of cold brew is noticeably different from hot coffee. Because cold water extracts flavor compounds more slowly and less efficiently than hot water, the resulting cup tends to have muted, rounded flavors. You'll often notice notes of chocolate and nuts, with a heavy, smooth body. Cold brew is consistently described as less bitter than hot coffee, and the acidity feels much lower, though we'll come back to whether that's actually true in a minute. Many people find cold brew naturally sweet tasting, even without adding sugar, simply because so much of what we perceive as bitterness in coffee is reduced. Now let's talk about how to make cold brew at home, because it's genuinely simple and you don't need any special equipment to do it. The standard ratio is about 125 grams of coffee to 1 liter of water. That's a 1:8 ratio, which is roughly twice as strong as a typical cup of hot coffee. Some people prefer an even more concentrated brew at 1:4 or 1:5, especially if they want to dilute heavily or use it for drinks with milk. In terms of grind size, a medium grind works best. Many recipes call for coarse ground coffee, but because cold water has a harder time extracting from coffee, a slightly finer medium grind actually produces a better result. Combine your ground coffee and cold water in any container. A large jar, a Tupperware, or a French press all work perfectly well. Cover it and let it steep for 18 hours at room temperature or 24 hours in the fridge. Steeping in the fridge slows extraction slightly, which is why it needs a bit more time. After steeping, Filter the coffee through a cloth or paper filter. Cloth filters let the natural oils from the coffee through, giving the cup more body and richness. Paper filters produce a cleaner, clearer cup, but strip some of that body out. Both are great options depending on your preference. Once filtered, store it in the fridge, and it'll stay fresh for up to 7 days. Just remember to dilute it when you pour. A 1-to-1 ratio of concentrate to water or milk is a good starting point. One type of cold brew worth mentioning on its own is nitro cold brew. Nitro cold brew is regular cold brew that has been infused with nitrogen gas. When poured, the tiny nitrogen bubbles create a creamy, cascading effect that looks a lot like Guinness. It also changes the way the coffee tastes. The nitrogen adds a subtle sweetness and a velvety mouthfeel that makes the drink feel even smoother than regular cold brew. There's also some evidence that the nitrogen infusion slows oxidation, which helps preserve the coffee's flavor over time. Nitro cold brew was invented by food scientist Nate Armbrust while working at Stumptown, and it's now widely available at cafes where it's kept under pressure in a keg and poured from a tap. You can also make it at home using a nitro whipper, which is easy to find online and not very expensive. A question that comes up a lot is whether cold brew is really lower in acid than hot coffee. The short answer is, it's complicated. Cold brew and hot coffee actually have very similar pH levels, typically falling between 4.85 and 5.13. So chemically speaking, they're about the same. What's different is something called titratable acidity, which measures the total amount of acidic compounds in the liquid. Cold brew has lower titratable acidity than hot coffee, and that's what our palate picks up on when we say something tastes acidic. So cold brew genuinely does taste less acidic, and it genuinely does have fewer acidic compounds overall. It just isn't dramatically different at the chemical level in terms of pH. If you have acid reflux or are particularly sensitive to acidity in coffee, cold brew may feel gentler, but low-acid specialty coffee is actually a more reliable option if that's a serious concern. What about caffeine? There's a persistent belief that cold brew is extremely high in caffeine, but it's a bit more nuanced than that. An undiluted cold brew concentrate does contain more caffeine than a typical cup of hot coffee, about 70 milligrams per 100 milliliters, compared to around 40 milligrams for filter coffee. But cold brew is almost always diluted before drinking, which cuts that amount roughly in half. Diluted cold brew actually ends up with slightly less caffeine than hot brewed coffee, partly because cold water is less efficient at extracting caffeine than hot water. So if you're drinking cold brew the way most people do, with water or milk added, you're probably getting less caffeine than you would from a regular cup of drip coffee. One last thing to know, cold brew and iced coffee are not the same drink. Iced coffee is brewed hot and then chilled over ice, which means the full range of flavor compounds that develop during hot extraction are present in the final cup. For that reason, iced coffee tends to have a more complex, vibrant flavor profile than cold brew. Cold brew, by comparison, has that smoother, more muted profile we've already talked about. The trade-off is shelf life and practicality. Iced coffee needs to be made fresh and consumed within a few hours. Cold brew can sit in your fridge for a week. For cafes that need to serve a lot of cold drinks quickly, cold brew is far more practical. For people who want the most flavorful cold coffee experience, iced coffee made with high-quality beans has the edge. Cold brew is one of those drinks that rewards a little understanding. Once you know why it tastes the way it does, how to adjust your brew time and grind size, and what to expect in terms of caffeine and acidity, you can really dial it into your taste. And if you've never tried making it at home, it's one of the easiest things to prep the night before and wake up to in the morning. If you want to dive even deeper, we've linked our full blog post on cold brew in the description below. It covers everything we talked about today and more. And if you found this helpful, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. We'll see you in the next one.